This section is devoted to addressing how the presence of different European religious and ethnic groups contributed to a significant degree of pluralism and intellectual exchange, which were later enhanced by the Great Awakening and the spread of enlightened ideas. The role and impact of religion on the colonies significantly changed in the first 100 years of the British North American colonies' history. As we learned in Chapter 3 and 4, the Puritans of New England, with the exception of Rhode Island, established theocratic communities that were heavily influenced by their Calvinist beliefs. Though religious zeal burned less brightly in the southern and middle colonies, most colonists identified as members of a church. By the advent of the American Revolution, all but 4 colonies would have established, meaning tax-funded, churches. In New England, it was the Congregational Church, and in the southern and middle colonies, it was the Church of England. These demographics point to an importance of religion in the founding of the colonies politically and the colonies' cultural ties with Mother England. But as the 18th century opened, the religious fervor of the Puritans and the cultural loyalty of the colonists had begun to wane. Over half of the population was not English, and though the majority of Americans identified as members of a variety of Christian churches, church records reveal that most Americans had stopped attending worship services regularly. Efforts to revive colonial religious participation and the spiritual authority of the church led to the first intercolonial cultural movement, the Great Awakening. This table demonstrates the establishment or tax-supported churches in the colonies by 1775, a year before the Declaration of Independence. You can see that the Congregational Church, which reflected Calvinist Puritan values, was established in all of the New England colonies with the exception of Rhode Island. The Anglican Church took foothold in the southernmost colonies and the city of New York and surrounding counties. Rhode Island, New Jersey, Delaware, and Pennsylvania, thanks to their more democratic nature and influenced by non-Protestant groups, maintained independence of church and state. This table shows the estimated number of members of different denominations. Note that the estimated total membership to churches is overwhelmingly the majority of colonists. However, other records would show that most people, despite their membership, did not attend worship regularly. The Church of England, the official church of the English realm, was technically brought to the New World with the first settlers to Virginia and became the established religion of 6 royal colonies, including Virginia, both Carolinas, Georgia, and the urban centers of New York and Maryland once the proprietorship of Lord Baltimore was suspended. Religious zeal did not define these colonies, nor did it define the Anglican Church. Sermons at the COE were shorter, and the clergy so ill-prepared that the king was convinced to establish the College of William and Mary to better train Anglican ministers, so they would stop driving away members. While in England, the COE represented the king's domain both over the state and the church, but it failed to spread its influence to North America. Efforts to require other Atlantic coast colonies to recognize the Church of England as the official denomination met ardent opposition. Puritans objected to the worldliness of the church, and the liberal colonies objected to the violation of their liberty to do without a state-sanctioned place of worship. Ultimately, the COE represented the cultural status quo of England, and its power waned the less English the colonies became. Anglican ministers even had to be ordained in England. So as the revolutionary spirit caught fire in the congregational churches, Anglican church clergy became stalwarts for loyalism. As you may recall from Chapter 3, the Puritans that migrated with John Winthrop in 1630 had not been separatists like their Pilgrim cousins that established Plymouth in 1620. Originally, Puritans had tried to reform the Church of England from within. When the English Civil War drove them to the shores of Massachusetts, they technically still belonged to the COE. But very quickly, the Puritans instituted their own fanatical standards. For example, limiting church membership to those that had experienced conversion and permitting more democratic participation in the affairs of the church by those visible saints. The Puritan church, controlled by the will of the congregational members, became known as the Congregational Church. So influential was Puritanism in New England that the Congregational Church was established and funded by taxes in all of the colonies except Rhode Island. As discussed in Chapter 4, theocracy, or religion-driven politics, dominated New England. And while the grip of New England theocracy would loosen by the end of the 17th century, congregational churches remained deeply political. Congregational ministers routinely preached on political issues in an effort to sway how their members voted and acted as citizens. As the early rumblings of the Revolution against Britain could be heard, some of the most seditious rhetoric could be emanating from the congregational church pulpits. The Age of Enlightenment, with its message about scientific study and a rational, knowable universe, dulled the apprehension and paranoia people felt about their eternal destiny. In other words, Calvinist doctrine about predestination and piety didn't drive new converts into the church the way it had in the 17th century. Furthermore, the halfway covenant was only partially successful in its mission. While more people than just the visible saints were identifying themselves as members of the congregational church, the watered-down requirements for church membership dampened the flames of Puritan zeal. Thus, the more secular the church became, the less political and culturally influential it became as well. Comparative to Europe, religious tolerance in the 18th century was greater in the colonies. It should be noted, however, that part of the reason there was less discrimination against Catholics and non-Christians was because there were far fewer people of those non-Protestant religions living in British North America than there were in Europe. As theocracy loosened its grip on New England's laws and customs because of the region's shifting demographics, colonists no longer felt pressure to sit through boring intellectual sermons about Calvinist doctrine. Furthermore, new religious theology offered more inviting alternatives to the dreary dogma of predestination. Jacobus Arminius, a Calvinist reformer from Holland, challenged the tenets of predestination, offering as an alternative that anyone, not just an elect few, could receive salvation if they accepted God's divine grace. Mainline Calvinist theology attacked Arminianism as heresy and rejected it, though many congregational churches by the 18th century would grudgingly concede that conversion was not necessary for church membership. Arminius himself died long before his theology grew widespread and was mostly adopted in North America and became the basic tenet of other Protestant denominations like John Wesley's Methodist Church, which today is the third largest denomination by membership in the United States. The church's loss of cultural and political influence in British North America set the stage for a rousing religious revival that would sweep through the American colonies during the 1730s and 40s. The movement began with Calvinist minister Jonathan Edwards, whose congregational church in Northampton, Massachusetts, drew large crowds eager to hear the great orator preach vivid, emotionally driven sermons about hellfire and damnation. Another preacher found success in using a similar dramatic style of ministry. George Whitefield, a cross-eyed traveling minister from Gloucester, England, began touring the North American colonies in 1738. With his booming, deep voice and small but animated body, Whitefield trumpeted Calvinism's message of human helplessness and God's divine power. Thousands of unchurched Americans flocked to his field revivals, where his sermons moved people both to tears and wild frenzy. He was a spectacle to behold. Some historians consider Whitefield to be America's first celebrity. This is an image of George Whitefield preaching. Americans of both genders and all races and regions were spellbound by Whitefield's emotional oratory. Even Native Americans and African slaves were invited to these revivals. Ministers of every region of America and across denominational lines soon found inspiration in the styles of Whitefield and Edwards. Professional clergy and lay ministers took to the pulpits and to the country roads a new style of preaching that shook audiences with emotional appeal. Despite its success, there were traditionalists that found theatrics and emotionalism of revivalists to be vain and the audiences they drew to be repugnant. Because Orthodox clergymen scorned how hot the fires burned within the wave of new ministry, they became known as the Old Lights. Conversely, Edwards, Whitefield, and their contemporaries were dubbed New Lights. So divisive was the issue of how to preach that the Congregational Church split over the issue, the New Lights forming the Presbyterian Church and leaving the Old Lights as the Congregationalists. Just as Arminianism drew members of the established churches away from new denominations, so did emotionalism. The Baptist and the Methodist churches offered colonists a ministry that was more direct, spiritually invigorating, and offered everyone the opportunity for salvation. This emphasis and creation of a multitude of new denominations did revitalize religiousness in the American colonies. For example, it sparked a new wave of missionary work, especially amongst Indians and Black slaves. Some New Lights even began publicly deriding slavery as spiritually immoral. To meet the demands of growing congregations, a wave of New Light colleges like Princeton, Brown, Rutgers, and Dartmouth were also built. But the most significant historic impact of the Great Awakening was its role in developing a uniquely American culture. The Great Awakening was a mass movement that stretched across regional and religious lines. In other words, it was the first American pop culture movement. This shared experience greatly contributed to a growing sense of Americanism.